And in big breaking news coming in, Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a military operation in Ukraine. He made this announcement in a surprise speech on Russian television. The president called on Ukraine military to lay down its arms and said that its actions are self-defense against threats. He further blamed all responsibility for bloodshed on the Ukraine regime, saying that efforts to negotiate with NATO were in vain, and said that Russia has been trying for 30 years to negotiate. In big breaking news, once again, I'm reiterating, in big breaking news just coming in, President Vladimir Putin has announced military operation in Ukraine. He made this announcement in a surprise speech in Russian TV. This happened while the United Nations Security Council meeting was underway. Russian president called on Ukraine military to lay down its arms and has said that these actions are in self-defense against threats. He has further blamed all responsibility for bloodshed on Ukraine and has said that Russia has been trying for 30 years to negotiate. Putin says that Russia's attempts to agree on NATO non-expansion were in vain, also saying that Russia cannot feel safe, develop, exist with constant threat from Ukraine. And right now we're being joined by our correspondent Susan Teherani from New York. Thank you so much for joining us, Susan. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced military action in Ukraine. This as the United Nations Security Council meet was underway. What can you tell us about the latest on this?
Well, we do have a reaction right now. Joe Biden is closely monitoring the developments in Ukraine. He will be receiving updates from his security advisors. This is from Jen Psaki after Putin's announcement regarding this, military development in Ukraine in the Donbass region, as the United Nations Security Council decided to hold this emergency meeting, in essence, to urge Russia to stop its advancement into Ukraine. A sensitive time. Yeah.
Right. Susan, of course, there were calls for Russia to come back to the negotiating table. But what are the next steps on part of the United States, Ukraine and its allies?
Right. Well, we'll have to see how the United States and the Biden administration wants to proceed. So far, it had said that it wants to impose sanctions, step-by-step sanctions, depending on how Vladimir Putin decides to move forward. And they were hoping that perhaps those first set of sanctions, albeit, everyone on both sides of the aisle here in the United States agreed that they weren't tough enough. Even President Biden admitted that they probably wouldn't be enough to deter Putin. But I think the United States is going to move forward with more sanctions on the one hand. On the other hand, they said that the Biden administration said that it was going to provide military aid and facilities to Ukraine. And on the other hand, we did know that the deployment of U.S. troops and NATO troops from other parts of Europe will be deployed to Baltic states in case it's very clear that American troops will not be fighting in Ukraine, but in case Vladimir Putin has bigger ambitions, these troops will be stationed in NATO member states in the Balkan countries to protect those countries and their borders as well. This is a very fast-moving development, but I think it was very telling that Putin decided to make this announcement as the United Nations Security Council was making a plea to him to stop this incursion and this advancement.
Right, absolutely, Susan. Now, the United States has been warning of Russia staging a false pretext for a war now. And as per the speech, Putin says that Russia cannot feel safe, develop and exist with constant threat from Ukraine. How do you assess this, and also the alleged threat from Ukraine that he's talking about?
Right. I think we can add here to what, again, going back to what is really happening right now as we speak, and that's the United Nations Security Council meeting, and the Undersecretary General for the United Nations said that what we are hearing really on both sides of the aisle are threats and accusations, and there is a very difficult paths to verifying information coming out from both sides. The Ukrainian foreign minister really made a plea to the General Assembly earlier today, saying that the Ukrainians do not plan on attacking the Russians. They don't want to fight with the Russians. After that, President Zelensky of Ukraine made a plea to the Russian people, saying that, first of all, he tried to contact Vladimir Putin directly. Putin didn't take his call. That was something that the Ukrainian foreign minister told us when I asked him whether or not he had reached out to Foreign Minister Lavrov, his Russian counterpart. He said that Lavrov never really, since the time that he's been foreign minister since 2020, has never picked up his phone calls either, let alone right now during this crisis. So, you know, this is where we are right now, is the Ukrainians making a plea that they don't plan they want dialogue, they don't want war. The Secretary General made a direct plea to Vladimir Putin off the cuff at the beginning of the Security Council meeting, saying, Vladimir Putin, stop your troops from invading. But on the other hand, we heard in this televised statement by Vladimir Putin saying that he wants peace. And he wants dialogue, and he's not looking to, quote unquote, invade Ukraine. So, you know, this is what we're hearing from both sides. But again, you know, in these situations, I think actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely. Also now we're being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. Siddhant, thank you so much for joining us. You know what is happening. Russian President Vladimir Putin has made the decision of military operation in Ukraine. This is as the United Nations Security Council meeting was underway. How do you assess the situation? India has called for a diplomatic path forward as well.
Well, this is perhaps the biggest geopolitical earthquake of this century, perhaps after 9/11 and the American invasion of Afghanistan. But what has happened in the last few hours is certainly unprecedented. If we look at New Delhi's point of view, we saw the statement made by the Indian envoy to the United Nations. He specifically did not mention this time the Normandy talks, the Minsk Pact, something that has been talked about by the Indian envoy to the United Nations. The previous meetings, including the emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Ukraine on Monday. He, of course, reiterated India's focus on its nationals, but also this time, if we look at the statement that was made, was certainly more concerning in terms of he clearly saying that the situation can spiral out of hand, and that, of course, it has happened, because even as he was making the statement, we know that the announcement came from Moscow, even though it was 6 a.m. in Moscow and 10 p.m. in New York.
Right. Of course, Siddhant, just for more clarity on this, this is happening while the United Nations Security Council meeting was underway. The message has been clear. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a military operation. So how effective do you think these calls of diplomacy will prove to be now?
Well, it looks like it was perhaps the weakest moment of the United Nations Security Council since its formation in the last 70 years. It looked very helpless. At the Security Council, the diplomats basically saying something that they have said in the past as well. And interestingly, the president of the Security Council is Russia this month. The president gets a term of 1 month, and Russia is the president. Largely, it looks like that diplomacy has failed tonight in New York. And today in this part of the world, it doesn't look anything is going to happen. It looks like a full-scale invasion has now started, and only the repercussion, the fallout is something that the world is now waiting for. And of course, there will be repercussion here in Delhi as well, because India has to carefully balance between Moscow and Washington. We know yesterday the top Russian diplomat here in Delhi, the Indian media as well.
Right. Once again, going back to our correspondent from New York, Susan Tehrani. Susan, can you please take us through the statement from President Biden on the developments?
We do hear from President Biden right now saying that he is closely monitoring the developments in Ukraine. He will be receiving updates from his security advisors, and this is something that President Biden said that the actions that were taken by Russia were quote unquote unprovoked, and that he will be taking the next necessary measures, and according to Russia's actions and according to what he has been announcing.
Right. Also, now in light of this announcement, how can we see the situation unfolding on ground in Ukraine?
Do you know right now that correspondents that are on the ground, they say that they are hearing sounds of explosions. Some are saying that the minute that Vladimir Putin did announce that sort of decree to go into Ukraine and quote unquote demilitarize the Ukrainian military, they heard 4 explosions at the same time. The CNN correspondent that's on the ground in Kyiv says that she heard sounds of explosions one after the other as well. We haven't been able to verify that ourselves, but earlier today when we were talking to correspondents on the ground in Ukraine, they said that evacuation procedures were on the way. We do know that the airports in eastern Ukraine have been closed off. A state of emergency has been declared in that area, and you know, nonetheless, the situation is very tense. And we did have the Ukrainian foreign minister here in New York when all of that was happening earlier today, addressing the United Nations General Assembly and almost making a plea to UN member states, notably the United States, that act before it's too late, and in not so many words making a point that the United States and the Biden administration's measures so far, albeit welcome, have been too little too late. And I think tonight as we speak, and in the morning, which is your time tonight, New York time, as we speak, we see that perhaps that was true. And I think the Biden administration has to really take a second look and a hard look and to see whether or not it should have pulled through with those hard-hitting sanctions that it had promised earlier, when it said that if one Russian soldier goes into Ukraine, we're going to hit Russia with unprecedented sanctions and unprecedented reaction. Then perhaps maybe it would have deterred Vladimir Putin a little more. But here we are now.
Absolutely. Again, just going back to one other point made by Russian President Vladimir Putin, he said that Russia's attempts to agree on NATO non-expansion were in vain. Does this essentially mean that there is no hope of now a diplomatic solution or dialogue with NATO and West over the crisis?
You know, it's interesting that both sides are saying that they're still open to dialogue, and even as we're speaking right now, although really, you know, as Sadan mentioned, this is perhaps the United Nations Security Council's one of its lowest points and one of its moments that perhaps you can say it's the most out of touch with reality. I'm actually concerned if even the people, the officials that are making those statements know what's really happening on the ground right now. But despite that fact, the fact that you have the Russians in that room, and despite the fact that perhaps Vladimir Putin has stated that there is some room for diplomacy, maybe there is hope. I mean, you know, diplomacy usually is the last leg of the process that's sort of given up on. So we'll have to wait and see. But at this point, I think we can say that the diplomacy that America was patting its back on, and its allies were sort of saying that, you know, it was our move and our diplomatic path forward that deterred Vladimir Putin. That form of diplomacy, yes, has failed. We'll have to see on whose ground this diplomatic path forward will move forward with, just to prevent war at the end of the day. Yeah.
Right, Susan, I understand this is a evolving situation now, but what options does this leave Ukraine with? We know last time the last time we heard that they'd declared a state of emergency. What can you tell us?
They did. They declared a state of emergency. Their airports are shut right now, and I think at this point, what they are hoping that, first of all, is some sort of ceasefire agreement on the one hand, and on the other hand, really help and aid militarily, at least, coming not only from the United States but from NATO allies as well. And I think that another concern is really protecting not only their borders on the southeast side, but on the other side that they have also with Belarus as well. And then, the Crimean border is also very sensitive as well. So I think, border security is very important for them. The issue of migration and refugee is very important for them right now. And then, the issue of energy and who they will turn to ultimately. Are Ukrainians going to be able to really weather this storm by being a non-NATO member and just a quote-unquote ally of the United States and the West? Would that be enough for them to deter a Russian aggression, I think, is the main question on every Ukrainian's mind right now.
Absolutely, indeed. Susan, do continue to stay on with us. So if you're just joining us, this, of course, is the big story that we are tracking on WION, where the Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a military operation in the Donbas region of Ukraine. And now there are reports which are coming in which state that there are explosions that are being heard in some parts of Kyiv. These are media reports which state that there have been explosions that have been heard. Susan, just to take this conversation further in terms of how the West has, of course, been reacting, the fact of the matter is the troop build-up had been ongoing from the month of November. The United States had been warning of a possible false flag attack and a false flag operation, and also an imminent attack by the Russians. And now that it has begun, the question, of course, is, has the West in some ways been lacking in presenting a united front, that would have in some ways warned off Russia from taking any military steps?
Yeah, I mean, that has been the million-dollar question on whether or not the West had done enough. I mean, at the Munich conference, it seemed that, you know, the speeches really were meant not only to convince Vladimir Putin, but the side note was really to almost to convince themselves that, first of all, NATO is strong, relevant, and united, and also, you know, and then on the secondary note, to convince Vladimir Putin that NATO is strong and united. You really have to wonder whether or not, at the end of the day, the United States would, first of all, be able to impose the sanctions that it says that it wants to, on the one hand, and on the other hand, if it does go ahead with those quote-unquote hard-hitting sanctions, will Europe ultimately be on board? I mean, we're already seeing cracks in that with countries like Italy, who have sort of taken a step back because, at the end of the day, these leaders in Europe, they have an energy crisis, for better or worse, and this is the middle of winter. And once you start taking away Russian oil and gas, then, you know, their energy prices starts jacking up, and it's not just a Europe problem. Then it becomes an individual country problem. Then it becomes an election problem for each of these leaders. It becomes a population problem, and I think that's a problem that we're facing here in the United States as well. So yes, despite the fact that they are presenting a united front, to the most part, perhaps NATO has found some relevance after many years. It's found its footing, but in terms of being united in how it wants to deal with Russia, I think that's where the cracks are present, and I think Vladimir Putin understood that. That's why he was able to take this risk, at least as far as he's gone for now. We'll have to see what happens next. We do have a statement from President Joe Biden.
Yes, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, we just got a statement from the White House from Joe Biden, and he's calling Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine. He said the prayers of the entire world are with the people of Ukraine tonight as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. President Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction and that this attack will bring, and the United States and its allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way. The world will hold Russia accountable. He also says that he'll be monitoring the situation from the White House this evening and will continue to hold regular updates with his security team. He will meet his G7 partners and counterparts in the morning and will speak to the American people to announce the further consequences that the United States and its allies plan to have for Russia. Again, I think the Ukrainian people are hoping for more than prayers from Joe Biden at this point. Right. And I think the American people as well need a lot more explanation to see why, first of all, they should care about this conflict and why their gas prices are going to go higher now.
Absolutely, indeed. This, of course, is going to be the big question as to what the West will, of course, do. Because remember, one of the key points of contentions that Russia has been talking about is that it wants guarantees that Ukraine should not be a part of the NATO military alliance. Ukraine is not a part of the NATO military alliance. With that being the case, what will the West and what will NATO, of course, do in terms of trying to, in some ways, push back the Russians from against this invasion that has now been announced by the Russian president? These, of course, are the latest visuals that you're looking at on your screen of the capital city of Kyiv, the Maiden Square, the central square in Kyiv. This is what the scene looks like. Remember, this is a very crucial next few hours that we are looking at this point of time, and also to give us more updates in terms of what can, of course, be expected now that the Russian president has thrown down the gauntlet. He has announced a military operation in the Donbas region. We are joined by senior journalist Ray Locker, who's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Locker, this is something that we had been talking about for a long time now. Since November last year, Russia, through its actions, was building up its troops. According to estimates, we're given to understand that there could be as many as about 150,000 troops that have encircled Ukraine, that are very close to the border in Ukraine. All along, Russia had maintained that all of these soldiers were there as a part of a military drill. It has no intention of invading Ukraine. But now we've heard the Russian president on Russian state television announce a military operation. What do you make of this?
Well, he is absolutely a liar. He was lying when he said he had no intention to invade Ukraine. He showed that he's lied about that today. Why he's doing this is hard to understand. It really makes no sense from a geopolitical point of view. I mean, he must obviously fear something about Ukraine, a threat to him and his leadership, and we'll see how it plays out. I mean, so many people are acting in bad faith about this. The Republicans who emboldened Putin during the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, who basically did whatever Putin wanted, and now they have the nerve to call Joe Biden weak for something that's happened, you know, because of Vladimir Putin, who they've been catering to for years. It's mind-boggling. And for the people here to worry about, well, my gas prices are going to go up this because we've stood up to a dictator who invaded a country that was absolutely no threat to him, is just insanity in my view.
Absolutely, indeed. Do continue to stay on with us. And if I can bring in Siddhant Sibil, my colleague who's also joining us from New Delhi. Siddhant, India had been maintaining that the way forward to resolve this crisis in Ukraine is diplomacy. But now that the Russian president has announced a military operation, and also there are reports which speak of Russian tanks rolling into the Donetsk region in some media reports, are we to say that diplomacy in some ways has not succeeded in stopping any kind of a Russian incursion?
Well, of course, diplomacy has failed tonight, whether it's in New York, whether it's Moscow or any other place. But New Delhi will be closely watching the developments when it comes to the Ukraine crisis, because this is a major escalation. And of course, it impacts everyone, whether the person is in Africa or Asia. But specifically, we know the markets in Asia are bleeding. The Indian markets are set to open. Also remember that the oil prices will be majorly impacted. That there will be a substantial increase in the oil prices internationally. That impacts everyone here in India, with that impacting the inflation. So there will be other business impacts. But largely, we know that when it comes to India has been calling for restraint, but restraint is something that is no longer present in that room at the United Nations Security Council. But also interesting to note that today the Pakistani Prime Minister is in Moscow, and he meets the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Very bad timing for the Pakistani Prime Minister to be in Moscow at a time when the world, of course, is hurled towards this major brink when it comes to the situation on the ground in Ukraine. So that will be perhaps the key focus in terms of the Indian subcontinental view of the situation.
Right.
First, of course, how the situation pans out, and secondly, the Pakistani Prime Minister holding talks with the Russian President later today in Moscow.
Absolutely, indeed. Do continue to stay on with us, Siddhant, and my colleague Susan Tehrani is still live with us from New York. Susan, at this point of time, from the statement that has been put out by the Russian President, he said that there will be military action in the Donbas region. But for people who've been tracking this, build up to this conflict for so long, over 150,000 Russian troops amassed on all three sides of Ukraine, from the north in Belarus to the east from Russia, and also in the Crimean region in the south. For people who are looking at this, can this conflict remain contained within the Donbas region, or does it have the potential to spread further out into Ukrainian territory?